Hello everyone, welcome to Scriptorium's Extracting Deliverables from DITA webcast. My name is Sarah O'Keefe and I will be hosting or delivering this event. A couple of preliminary notes. You should be hearing me at this point. That note is more for those of you that perhaps are having problems with the audio. All of you as participants are muted, so we do actually have a very large number of people on this event. So everybody is muted. We do, however, want to encourage audience participation in a couple of ways. One is the Questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. You can use that to ask questions anytime during the session. And also, you can, we have a couple of polls that we're going to be doing. So we encourage you to participate in the polls and provide some feedback. And if you want to provide more detailed answers than perhaps what the polls allow, then you can certainly use the Questions tab to put in additional comments. You also have a chat interface, but I don't look at that one as closely. So if you want to reach me, definitely put it in the Questions tab. We are recording this webcast, but the participant information will not appear in the recording, and the Q&A period that we have scheduled for the last 10 to 15 minutes of this event will also not be recorded. And with that, I'll get started. The first thing I wanted to do was ask you about where you are with DITA. So what is your DITA situation, and you know, how is that going? Are you actually using it? Are you using it but having generation problems? And I believe there was also supposed to be another option for this is not something we want to do. It looks as though that one got dropped along the way. So you know, if you want to, you can certainly clarify in the Questions tab what other things might be going on there. All right, and I'll give that a couple more seconds. I do want to get to about 80 or 90% participation, and I can see that as we're going along. And then once I do that, I will close the poll, and we will take a look and see what kind of results we have. Now, I'm expecting to have a lot of people tell me that output is a problem or that perhaps you're researching DITA, but you know, you never quite know what you're going to get in one of these polls. Okay, so I'm up to about 86%. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results so that you can see them. And it looks like most of you are thinking about DITA. About a quarter of you are in DITA, and then a small number of you are happy, which is more or less what I would expect given the topic that we're dealing with here. All right. So with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the DITA deliverable categories. These are not official categories. These are sort of how I divide up the DITA deliverables for my own peace of mind to figure out where things need to go. And I've used sort of a kayaking theme throughout this, and I'll let you figure out what the implications are of the graphics that are there. So from a deliverable point of view, what we have is basically three categories. There is the category of HTML output and HTML-related kinds of things. There's the category of PDF and or print, or print via PDF. And then there's the category of custom output. These are things that are very deeply customized and not available out of the box, but need to be done for whatever reason. So for example, if many years ago we were asked to build PEG help or Windows CE help, those kinds of things where there simply is not any sort of initial deliverable that is helpful. So I like to just, for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to divide up the DITA deliverable categories into these three classes. And I wanted to start by taking a look at the HTML issues. So if you have DITA content and you need HTML output, you basically have two major choices to make. The first choice is, am I going to use the DITA Open Toolkit or not? And you have to make that decision. If you decide not to use the DITA Open Toolkit, then there are a variety of help authoring or conversion tools that do provide support for DITA. I've listed some of them here. This is probably not an exhaustive list, and I apologize to any of the vendors that I've missed here, but that category of tool. So you really have to start out by making a decision about, Am I going to go through the toolkit, or am I going to go through the help authoring and conversion tools? And that's going to drive a lot of your decisions downstream. The DITA Open Toolkit process, the process for getting it up and running, involves sort of a lot of stuff. First, you have to get the DITA Open Toolkit itself installed, and that is untrivial. You have to have Java up and running. You need Ant, which is a build automation tool. You need an XSL processor. You need an XSL FO processor for PDF, which we'll talk about down the road. And then there's some other bits and pieces you might need. So for example, if you have EPS files that you want to output into your PDF or that you want to process, you need another component called Batik. And so the list of things that you have to install and configure and make sure that they are working is really quite lengthy and problematic. But let's say you get the Open Toolkit up and running, then you have to modify the component files inside the Open Toolkit to produce the output that you want. Now, these first two major bullets are one-time operations, basically. You do these things once, and then once they're working, in order to generate your HTML, or for that matter, any other output, you just generate from the command line. So the Open Toolkit process is highly intimidating from a configuration, establishing, getting it up and running point of view. But once you have it working, it's a push-button process. And I say here command line, but most of the XML authoring tools do allow you to glue the Open Toolkit into your authoring tool so that within the authoring tool you can say generate output. You don't have to actually type in a command line. Now, under the covers, it is actually doing a command line. So if you go in there and you need to change it or fix it or modify it or anything like that, then you're back to the command line and all these nasty text-based files. In the help authoring tools, it looks a little bit different. You set up a template or a configuration or some sort of an environment. You import your DITA content. You can optionally make changes in the help authoring tool. It's not recommended, but it can be done. And then from there, you publish to HTML. Now, this looks appealing because many of us already know how to set up templates in a Flare or a WebHelp or a whatever. And file import is a lot less intimidating than some of the things you have to do with the Open Toolkit. Make changes in the help authoring tool is appealing because, oh, what if I just missed one little thing and I just want to tweak it at the last minute? And then we know how to publish. So the help authoring tools potentially present a lower learning curve, a smaller gap between what you already know and what you need to know how to do in order to publish DITA, but there are trade-offs there. So these last-minute changes that you are then allowed to make if you're using a help authoring tool, in a sort of traditional author stuff and then publish, you can make last-minute changes, last-minute tweaks right before you sort of push the button and say, give me HTML or give me whatever I'm doing. In the DITA Open Toolkit, the biggest difference between the Open Toolkit approach and the sort of traditional use a help authoring tool approach is that you don't have that anymore. You do everything in your source and then you publish. You don't have that intermediate step of a publishing tool that you can tweak in. And what we've found from experience is that transitioning from this idea of I can fix some stuff at the last minute to no you can't, you have to do everything in the source is very painful. And there are costs and benefits associated with that. So the cost of allowing tweaking, let's say you have a DITA to RoboHelp to publish model, the cost of allowing tweaking in RoboHelp is that you potentially then have to go back to the source and make those changes again. Instead, you really need to make them in the source directly and then push a button. Now, if you agree to the concept that no changes are ever made in the publishing tool, in the help authoring tool in this case, then it follows that probably you should just make all your changes in the source and get a complete push button from the DITA Open Toolkit. And the DITA Open Toolkit does have better support for languages, for localization, than any of the sort of commercial authoring tools. So those are sort of the costs and benefits that you look at. There's a mindset change and a learning curve versus better automation, increased automation. So in my opinion, the DITA Open Toolkit is clearly the best choice for HTML output. You you just don't gain a lot by running it through a help authoring tool. You can do light customization, sort of formatting and making it look pretty with CSS, which most of us are, relatively comfortable with or should be. If you need in-depth customization, that would be done with extensible style sheet language, XSL. That's a little scarier. You lose arbitrary formatting, and I think I mentioned that the actual configuration, setting it up process is pretty painful, but you get complete automation. And I should also mention really good localization support. So those are kind of the trade-offs you're looking at there, and I don't see enough benefit from a help authoring tool to justify the decreased automation. However, there is one sort of glaring exception to this overall rule or opinion or best practice or whatever you want to call that, and that is WebHelp. If you need an HTML-based help system with a tri-pane interface, so in RoboHelp it's called WebHelp, I think in Madcap Flare it's called WebHelp, MIF2Go, DITA2Go has something called OmniHelp, that type of interface. If you need that, it is not supported in the Open Toolkit out of the box. That means you have to customize the Open Toolkit to provide support for WebHelp, and it is a really, really significant kind of customization. It's a major undertaking. So you balance that against, well, if I take a Flare, and I think I left out RoboHelp and I shouldn't have, but you take a Flare or a RoboHelp or an ePublisher Pro, DITA2Go, and also XMetal, which is an XML authoring tool, and TriSoft, which is a CMS. All of those have WebHelp interfaces, or they have support for generating WebHelp, which you do not get out of the box from the DITA Open Toolkit. So you get that as a feature if you license one of these tools, and then you have to balance the license cost of the tool against the Open Toolkit customization effort, and you have to make a decision there whether licensing a help authoring tool or one of these tools, they're not all help authoring tools, is worth it versus the cost of building WebHelp essentially from scratch inside the DITA Open Toolkit. So somebody mentioned Eclipse Help. Eclipse Help is similar to WebHelp, but it requires an Eclipse interface, which if you're shipping something that's not Eclipse-based, then you probably don't want to do that. But it is out there as an option, yes. So let's talk about PDF. PDF is actually a much, much, much more complicated kind of problem. A couple of questions coming in. Let me address those. Chum, there is support for Chum for HTML help out of the box in the Open Toolkit. It does provide that, yes. And let's see, the output interface provided by a component content management system like Arbortext, that is also a possibility, yeah. So you could take a look at something like that. But again, you're going to be balancing, hey, they give me WebHelp versus I have to license the tool, which is, not inexpensive, let's put it that way. Okay, so let's talk about PDF. For PDF, which is a much, much more difficult problem than HTML, because PDF is a much, much more complicated kind of format than HTML, you basically have three major categories of options. Again, the DITA Open Toolkit, and there's some complexities within that, which I'll talk about, page layout applications, and then I made this broad category of other. So first of all, I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about why PDF publishing is hard. PDF is difficult because, for starters, a printed page layout is much more complex than an HTML layout. So when you go in and you say, I want to render HTML, you can render a minimal HTML page with a couple of tags, an HTML tag, a body tag, a couple of P tags, maybe a class tag to format your paragraphs, and it will render in the browser. In PDF, you have to specify the page size, you have to specify the margins, you have to specify the font that you want used for everything. Now, you can make complex HTML output, of course, but minimal HTML output is not so challenging, and minimal PDF doesn't really exist. You can't really leave out all those things. So that's problem A. Problem B is that the extensible style sheet language formatting objects, or XSLFO language, has to support those things, and therefore XSL FO is sort of an order of magnitude more complicated than XSL. You can use XSL to produce HTML from your DITA content. You need XSL FO to produce PDF. So XSL is not unchallenging, but XSL FO is really, really hard. So just hard. Taking XML, which is basically markup, and pushing it into your page layout tools, which is another option to look at. So now you're talking about taking your XML, and pushing it into, let's say, FrameMaker. Can be done, it does work, and it gives you an easier way of formatting stuff than dealing with FO coding, but even that configuration process is challenging. And then the other thing you're going to run into is that, again, when you automate, you give up the ability to do page-by-page formatting. You give up the ability typically to do copy fitting and to say, oh, I don't like that page break, let me tweak some things to make it look better. And that, I think, from experience, is actually the most painful part of this whole thing. As useful and valuable as automation is, giving up control of the page and letting go of the look and feel of the page in the sense of having line by line or paragraph by paragraph control is difficult. And I'm one of the worst offenders in this office. Even I struggle with this, where I look at a page and I say, oh, that looks terrible. Let me rewrite that last paragraph so that everything gets pushed to the next page. This is not what you're supposed to do. This is very bad, and even I do it, so this is not a good thing. So I wanted to ask you about the 5 stages of DITA-based PDF publishing. The 5 stages of DITA-based PDF publishing are basically denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I think there is absolutely no coincidence at all that this matches up to the famous grief stages. That is basically what you're going to go through as you're looking at this. I get pretty often get people saying, oh, you act as though this is so difficult. How hard could it possibly be? And I tell them, please, feel free. Feel free to go and do it on your own. I have no problem with that, at which point they move on to stage 2 of why is this so difficult. And then there's, anger and some other things going on. This is a non-trivial kind of problem. And, I'm kind of trivializing it here, but this is really how it goes. It is just a really, really challenging problem for a variety of reasons. Okay, I'm going to give you another 10 seconds or so, and then I'm going to close this poll and see what people come up with. So in the end, you do end up needing to move on. I'm going to close this now and share the results. So here we are. 8% of you are in how hard could it be. Half of you are in this is hard and I hate it. Maybe this will work with different tools or people. Yeah, and 21% of you have reached the stage of, oh well, whatever. At least it goes fast. And I think that's where we're all going to end up, fortunately or not. I don't really have a judgment on whether that's a good thing or not. It's just how it's going to be. Okay, so thank you for that. Let's take a look here. So here are your choices. The Open Toolkit, a page-based layout tool such as FrameMaker, InDesign, or Quark. And FrameMaker is really a special case, and I'll talk about that. And again, a help authoring or conversion tool. You could take your DITA content and push it through, for example, Flare to produce PDF. That is one of your options. All right, so PDF through the DITA Open Toolkit. As challenging as HTML is, PDF is an order of magnitude worse. You lose the ability to tweak, which is, from experience, I can tell you, deeply painful. And almost certainly this is where it's going to go in the long run. This is where I see people going because the automation that you get from the DITA Open Toolkit is compelling. When you can go from source DITA content to generating a PDF in a couple of seconds or in 20 seconds, and it supports 50 different languages, that is compelling. So I think this will win in the long run, but right now it just really hurts. So in order to make this work, you would customize the default output to your requirements, and get that all up and running in theory one time. Once you have your template, you'd be good to go. You have to make the fonts that you're using available to your FO processor. There's an open source processor called FOP, which is made by Apache. There are also others, commercial processors like XEP and Antenna House. So you have to sort of configure them to know where the fonts are, which is less trivial than it sounds. And again, you run an ant command on the command line to generate your PDF, and you can hook this into an XMetal or an Oxygen or Arbortext or any other kind of editor like that. The problems you're going to run into here are fonts. The Open Toolkit running through FOP by default recognizes a couple of fonts, something like Arial and Times New Roman. So if you want to use something else, you have to register the fonts, and that turns out to be significantly difficult. It shouldn't be that hard, but it's really kind of obnoxiously difficult, and you run into font metrics files and just horrible stuff. So that's a problem. Formatting is a problem in that if you think about what you're doing in XSL FO, what you're essentially doing is a formatting template similar to what you would do in a Word or a FrameMaker or one of those, but you're writing code to do that. So if you think of the style designer, the paragraph designer that you have available to you in a word processor tool, you're essentially encoding what's in that paragraph designer in a text-based programming language. So you're reverse engineering a Word or FrameMaker or Flare or WebHelp template. Not fun. FO itself, formatting objects, the language itself is difficult, and then in addition to that, there are problems with the implementation in that there are some things that should work, but they don't. So there's a command in FO that's supposed to do something specific, but depending on what processor you're using, maybe it just doesn't quite work. And then FOP, which is the Formatting Objects Processor, this is the open source processor, it has some issues. So you have to address that, and you have to work around the issues and make sure you don't, run into memory problems and those kinds of things. Some of these issues are addressed by getting a commercial FO processor, but others are simply sort of the nature of FO. So there's really some kind of significant problems to deal with there. So if you decide to do PDF via FrameMaker, now we're talking about you take your DITA content, you ingest it into FrameMaker, and then you produce PDF from there. Minimal configuration there would require you to modify the FrameMaker formatting template, which is of course not that challenging if you've used regular unstructured FrameMaker before, so that's nice. It generates very nice PDF. And because you go through FrameMaker and you have intermediate FrameMaker files, you can actually tweak to adjust the pagination if it didn't do exactly what you wanted it to. There are also some things that you could do as part of this that are difficult or perhaps impossible to do with FO. One of the things, for example, that FrameMaker does quite nicely and will do in an automated way is mixed column layouts, where a page has a section that's one column, and then let's say the bottom half of the page is two columns because some paragraph tag triggered that. That is difficult and or impossible to do in FO. Arbitrary mixed column layouts are a big problem. So in FrameMaker, you would modify the template to meet your requirements once. You have to address white space. FrameMaker does not like extra white space in the XML files. It's not supposed to be significant, but it turns out that it is if you're dealing with FrameMaker. So typically, we write a little XSL template, a little XSL file that does some pre-processing as you're importing into FrameMaker. You open the map file. If you're in version 8 and earlier, you generate an intermediate book, and then you go off to PDF. So that's the FrameMaker process. The problems you run into here, white space. So this is tabs, spaces, new line characters. Those shouldn't be a problem, but they are. If you have specialized your DITA content, if you're not just using basic DITA, then you're going to have to customize FrameMaker to support the specializations, and that could be a significant amount of work. Round tripping can be problematic, so if you want to open your DITA files in FrameMaker, edit them there, and then go back out And authoring also has some issues. The DITA implementation in FrameMaker has some limitations. But in terms of generating nice PDF relatively quickly, it does a pretty good job. If you're going to use FrameMaker, we highly recommend that you use the DITA FMX plugin. It addresses a lot of the limitations in vanilla FrameMaker. It's pretty inexpensive, so take a look at that. It's made by a company called Leximation, LEXIMATION.com. All right, so let's take a look at PDF via InDesign, which is one that I hear about a lot. InDesign produces just beautiful type, gorgeous pages, and it has a very nice, very sophisticated hyphenation engine. That's all wonderful. You can tweak your files just as you would in FrameMaker. You can get an intermediate DITA or an intermediate InDesign file, tweak it to make it all perfect, and then generate your PDF. However, there's no default support for DITA, so there's a lot of configuration work required. And where white space in FrameMaker produces cranky errors, in InDesign it tends to produce a failure to import. So that is a big problem. The process here would be to take your DITA content and write a pretty extensive XSL transformation that turns the DITA content into InDesign-friendly XML. And I've given you a not comprehensive list here of some of the problems you will run into. InDesign does not understand map files with references, so you have to flatten and expand the map file and make one monster XML file that has everything in it. It doesn't understand conrefs, content references, so you have to resolve and flatten those. So you essentially get an XML file with everything in it. InDesign likes images and tables to be structured in a particular way, and that particular way happens to be incompatible with DITA. So you basically reprogram your images and your tables and how they're referenced to be the way you want them. You've got to address the white space, similar to what you have to do on the FrameMaker side. And finally, you have to address cross-references, which don't really come in at all. And I have not found a way to do this with XSLT. I think it has to be addressed on the InDesign side with scripting. You then need to set up a template in InDesign, which shouldn't be so bad. And then finally, you do an import to bring the modified XML in. So the first two major bullets here would be one-time configuration, and then the last one would be what you would do every time, is do some sort of an import, bring the file in, and it should flow it in. You could then potentially tweak it if you wanted to, and then generate your PDF. If this is something that you're interested in, we have a proof of concept of this on our wiki at wiki.scriptorium.com. If you scroll down to the bottom, there's some links to the files there. They are not production ready, so if they don't work, that would be expected, but it should give you a proof of concept. Problems you run into here, lots of pre-processing. The XML you need to bring into InDesign doesn't really bear any resemblance to the DITA content, so that's a problem. Round tripping, I suppose it's theoretically possible, but I would strongly recommend against attempting it. So this needs to be a one-way trip where you take the DITA content, pull it into InDesign, and publish, and then throw that away and go back to your DITA source files. I would not attempt to author DITA in InDesign. Again, it's probably theoretically possible, but I don't recommend it, and white space is an issue. So those are the major things that you're going to run into here. The help authoring tools. Most of the help authoring tools will also allow you to, or probably all of them, will allow you to generate PDF. If you're going to use the help authoring tool for WebHelp, for cross-browser, cross-platform help, I would consider this. But if you're just rendering PDFs, then I would stay away from the help authoring tools, because I don't think there's a lot of incentive to go in that direction. So the decision that you really have to make is, are you more interested in typography or are you more interested in automation? If you want typography, if your audience is or your deliverable is the Journal of Fine Typography, then you need something like InDesign or Quark. If you need automation, you want the DITA Open Toolkit. The push-button output that you get is almost magical. And if you want something kind of in the middle, where the typography maybe isn't quite as spectacular, but it's good, and the automation isn't quite as spectacular, but it's decent, then you might look at a FrameMaker. I do want to point out that you really, I think, need to think about your audience and whether they care about your PDF formatting. I care. I'm kind of offended by poorly formatted PDFs or print, but I see a lot of it. And the question is, will your audience reject your product or your deliverable if the PDF is sort of, adequate but not great? I don't think there's any question that most of the people on this call would like to produce very attractive PDFs. The question is that really necessary, or is that something that we care about as publishing professionals? So I think there's this question of, does the audience care? And then there's the question of copy fitting. The more copy fitting you do, the more hands-on kind of tweaking you have to do. Less copy fitting equals greater automation. So that is kind of the balance that you have to strike. It's pretty clear that if it's completely automated, it's cheaper. And there's this question of whether automating less and doing more copy fitting and making it more attractive equals better value for that PDF. And that is a really, really kind of hard question. So this is a difficult place to be, I think, because for all of us that come from print publishing, we really don't want to go there. So that's kind of where we are. All right, I've got a couple of questions related to this that I want to throw in here. I've got some others that I'm not ignoring you. I'm just going to defer them until the end because they are interesting, but they don't quite belong in this sort of section. So one question about statistics on desirability of fine typography in technical publications. I have seen a study that indicated that better formatting equals better comprehension. My question is, can you get the formatting to good enough, or does it actually have to be, really, really well done? And I don't have an answer to that. Somebody else asked about PDF using the HTML output. We've actually looked at that for a customer. It's not impossible, but you're going to be pretty limited in terms of what you can do in the PDF. So if you need to produce PDFs that are pretty straightforward, then yeah, you could probably do it that way. But I can assure you that they will not be very pretty. You can get reasonably pretty out of the DITA Open Toolkit. You're also not going to get, for example, a book out of the HTML output. If you need front matter, back matter, those kinds of things, you really need to go from the DITA source. Okay, I'm going to defer the rest of these. I will come back to them. So things to consider on the PDF side are these. Platform requirements. Do you have a requirement to, for example, author on a Mac? Because if so, you can pretty much rule out FrameMaker. Or sorry, to publish on a Mac, then FrameMaker is an issue. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about with platform requirements. Technical resources are something to consider. How technical are your people? Do you have any people that are technical enough to learn XSL or learn XSL FO? Do they want to? Do you have those people available to you, or is it completely out of the question? And if you can't publish through a help authoring tool, it's not going to happen. That's a legitimate reason to say we need to go through the help authoring tool. Typography, how good does the typography need to be? That's something to consider. And then we have the 3 V's, velocity, volume, and versioning. Velocity is how often do you publish? Are you publishing updates every day, every week, every month, every year, every 5 years? I have a customer who has updates that are made to their particular documents once every 3 years. That would be low velocity. If, on the other hand, you need to do things like nightly builds and deliver every evening, that would be high velocity. Volume. How many pages, how many topics, how much content do you have, and also in how many languages? So a group that has 2,000 pages that goes into 3 languages is very, very different from a group that has 20,000 pages that goes into 60 languages. So you need to look at your volume, and you can get a rough estimate of total volume by taking your page count and multiplying by languages. That gives you an idea of what kind of a scope you're dealing with. So in other words, 10,000 pages times 1 language is roughly equal to 3,000 pages in 3 languages. So don't quote me on the math, but that's kind of order of magnitude that you're looking at. So a 3,000-page document set that goes to 10 languages presents significant issues, much more so than a 10,000-page document set that's only in one language. And versioning. What kinds of versionings are you doing? Do you have customer-specific information? Do you do different versions of a particular tool? Do you have one of those scenarios where you have a web-based app that changes based on what kind of information or what kind of access the person that you're dealing with has? You need to look at those three, and in every case, higher levels of that, higher velocity, higher volume, higher versioning, all equates to factors that drive you towards automation. So I wanted to ask you about how you're planning to create PDF output, if you have thought about that. What do you think you'll be doing? And how do you think you're going to be handling this? And I did manage, in this case, to leave an other. So if you'd like, you can certainly specify that in the questions tab. But I'm curious to see where this is going. So while you're doing that, I have a question here about the DITA Open Toolkit. Is any work being done on the DITA Open Toolkit to make it easier to use? There are a few people that have built some sort of front-end kinds of things. So they have done stuff like, there's something called WinAnt, which drives the Ant interface. XMetal has done some work on producing an interface. When you go to publish, you don't really have to go to the command line. You can just use their front end. But in general, I would say that no, there is not work being done on the Open Toolkit itself. In fact, what we're seeing is that it seems to be getting more complex with every version. So there is a significant concern there that it's just going to keep getting more complex. And if you look at PDF, there was what's now called the legacy PDF transform, or the PDF1 transform, and then there's something called the PDF2, the sort of version 2 transform. Well, PDF2 is a lot more complex than PDF1. It's also got more features, but it is very, very complex. So I would have to say that, at least in my opinion, making the DITA Open Toolkit easier to use does not seem to be a top priority for the architecture committee. So something to think about there. Okay, I'm going to close this poll. I've got about 86% that have voted. Let's take a look here. So yeah, this is about what I expected. A third of you, give or take, are using the DITA Open Toolkit. 40% FrameMaker, 3% other page layout, probably InDesign or maybe Quark. 16% in the help authoring conversion, and 11% other. And I've got some responses here. One that says Arbortext, one that says Tech, and let's see. Multiple. DITA Open Toolkit and completely custom XSL to HTML, and DITA to Flare for WebHelp. Yeah, so number of different things. So, okay. So let's move on here, and I do have a slew of other questions which I will address. This is basically my not very sophisticated version of how this looks. And I actually have a chart version of this that has additional components in it, including things like Arbortext 3v2 publishing engine and some stuff along those lines, in a white paper we did on this topic. So if you go look on our website for the PDF publishing white paper, you'll see a more complex version of this chart. But basically, if your priority is typography, then you need InDesign. If your priority is speed, volume, versioning, then you need the DITA Open Toolkit. FrameMaker kind of sits in the middle here, is kind of how I see it. I did want to point out that PDF that comes out of the Open Toolkit is not necessarily ugly. It is ugly by default when you first open it up, and a lot of people do not do the work to make it pretty. And it is really a significant amount of work, but there's a difference between it starts out ugly and anything you produce from the Open Toolkit is ugly. So just something to keep in mind there. All right, now custom output is sort of this whole other class of stuff that you might need to do. So for example, something like your own implementation of web-based help built from scratch, man pages or other kinds of funky markup. DITA does have, I think it's NROF output, but if you need to do man pages to your specification, that might be a problem. If you're building to an existing formatting specification, that can be challenging. So if somebody hands you a CSS and says you have to use this CSS, rebuilding DITA, the DITA HTML output to support that can be tricky. And the other one that would fall in this category would be custom markup like IDML, which is the InDesign markup language, XPS, which is Microsoft's alleged PDF killer, or MIF, Maker Interchange Format, or MML, the Maker markup language, which is actually deprecated, but there's some people still out there. If you're going in this direction, then you are seriously out there in the wild, and you need to really be careful because you're going to need some people with some really, really hardcore skills to pull that off. So speaking of hardcore skills, the XSL programming skill that you're going to need if you go in the direction of the DITA Open Toolkit is really an issue. Are you going to have that in-house? Are you going to bring in contractors or consultants? And I think the thing to keep in mind here is that we're talking about something that goes a lot beyond somebody who's good with FrameMaker templates and beyond HTML coding and CSS. We're talking about really a baby programmer. And that, if you've got some people that are interested in going in that direction, then that's fantastic. But if you don't, then the Open Toolkit is going to be a significant challenge for you. Automation clearly has advantages. You can do incremental builds. You can do nightly updates of your documentation and post it to an internal website. You have zero manual formatting, so you cut out production time and effort. And you get really good localization support out of the DITA Open Toolkit, probably better than any of the other tools that we're dealing with. So that's something to consider. And it will, for example, do right-to-left processing. It has something like 50 languages already sort of built in and supported out of the box. So that's all extremely nice. The disadvantage is the initial configuration effort is significant. You're not going to get intermediate files for some last-ditch kind of tweaks, changes, all of that. And I say here book by book because I'm a little bit focused on the PDF issues. But you know, if you want book 1 to look different from book 2, you can't really go in there and do that. I mean, you could certainly create two kinds of PDF output, let's say an 8.5 by 11 version and an A4 version. But you have to go in and do that, and it has to be all set up and configured, and it's a lot of work. So you can't really say at the last minute, oh, wait, they told us they need A4, let me just tweak the template and make A4. It is not like that. So overall, for HTML, I would really recommend that you use the DITA Open Toolkit because I don't see a ton of value in the finagling or the tweaking there. For PDF, you'll notice I have a lot more text on this page. You really need to weigh the benefits of automation, the volume that you're dealing with against the difficulty of FO. You need to weigh the localization support if that is an issue for your organization or if you think it might be an issue for your organization in the future. You can consider the value of your existing assets. If you already have a FrameMaker template that is exactly what you're looking for, well, then it might be easier to just run everything into FrameMaker and use the existing template. And finally, I would step back a little bit and take a really hard look at your output requirements. How strict are they, and do they need to be that strict, or is it, at least in theory, possible to sort of simplify what you're doing on the PDF side and therefore make your life a little bit easier? So those are the things that I would consider on the PDF side.